Good evening. 13 months ago, started studying the book of Nehemiah. We are finally making it to the 13th chapter. Long time to get here, but I have thoroughly enjoyed this study, and we are going to wrap it up this evening. Book of Nehemiah is not a book about a wall. That's how we began 13 months ago. Book of Nehemiah is not a book about a wall. Nehemiah is about leadership. Nehemiah is about care for God's people. Nehemiah is about restoring the glory of God in broken situations. We're going to find out tonight Nehemiah is about failure. It's about men who try, and despite their good intentions, things don't go how they desire them to go. We're going to be looking through chapter 13 tonight and try to keep these things in our consideration. Details of Nehemiah's return in chapter 13 are going to reveal to us a very shameful situation that is going on. I want you to remember that this happens just chapters after what we read in chapters 9 and 10 and 11. There's been a people who made a covenant, people who made a series of promises about the relationship that they're going to have with God. They're going to do certain things. They're going to make Him the priority in their lives. That was then. Chapter 13 is now. It takes place some years in the future. And what we find is a sad realization that even with the best of intentions, the promises of man often fail to produce faithfulness to God. I want to begin reading verse 1 through 3 of this, just to get a little bit of this backstory before we go on. On that day they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and there was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So when they heard the law, they excluded all foreigners from Israel. It is important that we understand what's going on in chapter 13. This verse sometimes is not viewed just a little bit, but viewed a lot of bit as racist. People look at this and say, well, why would God say something like that about these people just because of who they are? Not about who they are. In fact, it has very little to do with them, more so that it has to do with Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, God makes a promise to Abraham. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And some 1,000 years later, God has not changed who He is, and His words and His promises have not lost their impact. The Moabites and the Ammonites are a race of people that descend through Abraham's nephew Lot. Read about that as after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot has this relationship, and this family is born out of the relationship between him and his daughters. And as we carry on through history, we find the Moabites and the Ammonites coming into contact with the Israelites as they're leaving Egypt. They're on their way through the wilderness. They're making their way to the promised land. And they come upon them, and as our reading reveals to us, they wouldn't offer even the least of blessing. Even to allow them to have bread and water, they would not offer them anything. And so God places a curse upon them. You can read about that in Deuteronomy 23 and verses 3 through 4. He places a curse that these people, the Moabites, the Ammonites, these people will never enter the assembly of the Lord. Now I want you to remember, this is pre-tabernacle or pre-temple. This isn't talking about them coming into temple worship. This is talking about them being a part of the people of God, the assembly of the Lord. You will not be numbered with my people, the assembly of those who belong to me. That's what we see happening here. They will not be part of the covenant people of God. They will not participate in the spiritual life with God. And then we go through the Bible and we reveal that there's a time when that exact thing happened. Ruth. What is going on with Ruth? Ruth is kind of the lens in which we should see this curse, in which we should understand the curse that God is bringing on, that it's not about a nationality, it's not about this people is better than that people, it's about a heart. Because Ruth does something that they wouldn't do. She makes a decision, a choice. Ruth is not born into the covenant relationship of God, but what she does is she chooses to be identified as one. She chooses to leave her anti-God culture. She chooses to leave her anti-God ways of thinking. She chooses to immerse herself into the people of God and to follow them, and their God will be my God. Remember, she leaves everything. She sacrifices everything she ever knew to follow Naomi and to be a part of her people. Now remember what you said in Ruth chapter 1 verse 16, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. And Ruth is allowed to enter into not only the assembly of the Lord, but she's identified as a part of the lineage of the Messiah, as of Christ. That's what we see happening here in Nehemiah chapter 13 so many years later. It's not about these people are better than those people. It's about God's faithfulness. It's about God's justice. When God judges the wicked, it has lasting consequences. It's still going on here in chapter 13. The thing that's being reminded to us in these first 3 verses is the people of God are holy. The people of God are set apart, and they're set apart not by what they are or what they've done, but by the God they serve. They needed to stay that way. So what we see here is written to provide background information. This is what should be going on. This is what should be taking place. But what we're going to read next is these things are not what's occurring. Go ahead and pick up with me in verse 4. We're actually going to read through to the end of the chapter. Now, prior to this, Eliashib, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah, had prepared a large room for him, where formerly they put the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils and the tithes of grain, wine and oil prescribed for the Levites, the singers and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. But during all this time I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king. After some time, however, I asked leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. It was very displeasing to me. So I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. Then I gave an order, and they cleansed the room, and I returned there the utensils of the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense. I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, so that the Levites and the singers who performed the services had gone away, each to his own field. So I reprimanded the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And I gathered them together and restored them to their post. All Judah then brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouse. In charge of the storehouses I appointed Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites. And in addition to them was Hanan the son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. Remember me for this, O my God. Do not blot out my loyal deeds, which I have performed for the house of my God and its service. In those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Also, men of Tyre were living there who were importing fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." It came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and that they should not open them until after the Sabbath. Then I stationed some of my servants at the gates so that no load would enter on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the traders and merchants of every kind of merchandise spent the night outside Jerusalem, and then I warned them and said, "Why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will use force against you." From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also, remember me, O my God, and have compassion on me according to the greatness of your loving kindness. In those days I also saw the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As for their children, half spoke the language of Ashdod. None of them were able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them and cursed them and struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God. And God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we then hear about you that you have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God by marrying foreign women? Even one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. So I drove him away from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I purified them from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priests and the Levites, each in his task. And I arranged for the supply of wood at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. Nehemiah 13 is one of the more sad chapters that we find in the Bible. After everything that has happened, after all of the things that Nehemiah has worked so hard to lead this people in, this is the picture we're left with. This is who we're talking about here at the end of the book, a people that have promised this is not going to be us anymore. How quickly have repeatedly went right back to their way of living prior to. And so what Nehemiah does, I know that was a whole lot to read, we're going to break it down, but what he does is he issues huge and sweeping reforms to try and fix these problems that he has met with when he returns from Babylon. And he begins with the temple. He begins at the heart of the picture of God's house, God's home amongst his people. Eliashib the priest had allowed Tobiah the Ammonite to take up residence in the courses of the house of God. Now, that's why we read chapter 2 and verse 10 earlier for our scripture reading. There we learn about Tobiah, that he is an Ammonite. He is one that our backstory at the beginning of chapter 13 reveals. He's not supposed to even be counted as a part of the assembly of the Lord, much less someone who's living in the very house of God. And if we could ask Eliashib today, why have you done this? He might argue, well, he wasn't in the house of God. He was in one of the courts. We took a side room, but that's not the problem. The problem is these people who have cursed you, and God has pronounced a curse upon you, people who are not holy, people who you're supposed to be standing out against, people that you are supposed to be set apart from. You've not only brought them in, not only given them a place to stay within the grounds of God's home, they're influenced. See, that's what Tobiah was. Tobiah was an influence. He's not just becoming a part of them, he's leading them. When you go back and read in chapter 6, at the construction of the wall, you find that many of the nobles are writing and exchanging letters with Tobiah, and Tobiah is actively trying to frighten Nehemiah. And Nehemiah says in verse 8, when he sees all these things, this is very displeasing. That seems a bit reserved, doesn't it? To me, it seems just a little bit reserved. Other translations say, this upset me so. I was so furious. I was so angry. It grieved me sore. Nehemiah goes in, and Nehemiah removes the things that do not belong. And that's where these reforms begin. Removing the things that do not belong. Does that sound familiar? We see that with Jesus in his life. Jesus does the very same thing when he comes to the temple of God, removing the things that do not belong in the home of the Father. We need to make sure we understand what this is describing. I've had people say today, I remember being in a Bible class once, doesn't that give us the right to throw somebody out that doesn't belong? This is our hearts that we're describing. And we're issuing sweeping reforms in the hearts of God people. We remove the things that don't belong in here. This is where we start. This is where change begins in the temple, in our hearts. But we also see that he moves from there into these financial reforms. Verses 10 through 14 talk about how the portions that had been given to the Levites for their different services to the house of God, how that had kind of fallen by the wayside and hadn't been picked back up again. And what did it lead to? This lack of contribution led to a lack of service. The Levites said, we've got to eat. Those contributions were for us to be able to provide for ourselves. And so every one of them has abandoned the work they were doing to go back to their farms, to raise food, to take care of their families. Notice what Nehemiah says about this. He doesn't go straight to the Levites. He says the lack of giving, that is a forsaking of the house of God. The Levites were wrong in what they were doing. Well, we're going to see that in just a moment. But Nehemiah begins this looking at the contributions. He says the lack of giving is a forsaking of the house of God. Very similar to the words of Haggai. In Haggai chapter 1, verse 4, the time has not come yet for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. God asks, why is it that my house lies desolate while each of you runs to your paneled homes? They might argue and say, your house isn't desolate. We haven't forsaken it. We've rebuilt it. Nehemiah equates the lack of giving to the work which was to go on within it as a lack or as a forsaking of it. And so how does he fix it? How does Nehemiah fix this problem? Nehemiah gets up and gives a fiery sermon while the collection plate is being passed around and the people passing it are looking you in the eye to see how much you're going to give into that collection plate. No. Nehemiah gets up and shows all the ways that we could use this money in extra good ways and do great and big things if only you people would open up your pocketbook. No. Nehemiah goes against the Levites. Get back. Nehemiah recognizes the problem isn't with the giving. Yes, the fact that they were not giving is a forsaking of the house, forsaking of the service of the Lord. He goes back to the Levites and says, you guys have responsibility. Work needs to be done. Service for the Lord needs to be done. Get back to work. What happened? Levites got back to work. People got back to tithing. The people got back to giving. I'm sure Nehemiah probably did have something to say to them. We read and as we've learned about his character, I'm sure that he had something to say to all those who had failed to give as they should. But what we're told, chapter 13, is this. Nehemiah reinstated temple service. People started giving. You know, growing up, being a part of small churches and working with small churches in the past, this issue comes up a lot. What are we doing whenever the collection plate seems like it's not as full as what are we doing when the number that we post on the side is not as high as we think it should be? And inevitably, the responsibility oftentimes this falls on the preacher. You got to do something about this. You got to preach. You got to make people feel guilty. Or it turns to we got to find ways to attract more people because more people equals more money. What if we took the approach of Nehemiah? We got to get to work. We got to get to work in our community. We got to get to work in our families. We got to get to work to the service of the Lord and see what serving God will bring as a blessing to His people. That is our response. When we look and we are worried, we're concerned that maybe the contribution doesn't meet the needs of the service. Work, trusting God. Let's put our backs into it and see what God will provide. See if God doesn't bless us with cheerful givers. The next thing we see Nehemiah reform are the people's priorities, verses 15. Now, your Bible might, like my Bible, might say that he does some restoration or reforming of the Sabbath. But I can't help but find that as being just slightly silly, because the Sabbath day hasn't changed. The Sabbath has not been modified. The people have. That would be like reforming my yard with AstroTurf because I'm too lazy to get out there and mow it. That's the way we're going to fix this problem, is just fill the whole thing with AstroTurf. Might fix the appearance. Does not fix the problem. Nehemiah is addressing a clear-cut violation of God's Sabbath laws by a people who had shifted their priorities away from Him. Verse 15 doesn't really seem all that bad when we start reading it. It says they're dealing with food. And after all, people have to have food. These are essential items. Surely there's nothing wrong with this. But notice the very end of that verse. He says, I admonished them on the day they sold food. What we read about and the attitude that we see in Nehemiah 13 is a desire for money. And we can make more money if we sell 6 days out of the week, 7 days out of the week instead of just 6. We can make more money if we work on the Sabbath. And that had led to danger. Because what it led to was a raising up of their desires, a raising up of their desire for more stuff, for their more money in their bank accounts, more items in their homes, as opposed to an importance on honoring God. Verse 18, Nehemiah says, what you're doing, by choosing this priority of you and your desires and your wants and your pockets, by choosing that, you're adding wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. Notice that Nehemiah doesn't make this a personal issue. Notice that Nehemiah doesn't just say, man, the vendors, they're going to get what's coming to them. People engaged in this, they're going to get what's coming to them. It's not a personal issue. This is a people's issue. It seems like maybe, in large, the people had just accepted this is our new normal. This is the way we do things today. And nobody was stepping up to say what Nehemiah was saying, what needed to be said. This doesn't honor God. We need to cut it out. We made these decisions in the past, and maybe we thought they were really important, and maybe we even thought that they served a greater purpose that glorified God, but they don't. They're taking our focus away from Him. We've made a mistake, but we need to do better. I'm wondering if that's not the connecting theme that runs throughout chapter 13. It's not just that sin was going on, that sin was going on unconfronted. Eliashib, the high priest, is an Ammonite living in the temple of God. No one say a word to him? Does no one try to stop this? The Levites leave and abandon the work going on there. Does no one go and try to encourage them? Does no one say that this has to change? The Sabbath is being profaned and is adding wrath, not to those who are doing it, but to Israel, but the people of God. Why? Why? Because no one is saying a word about it. Because no one's trying to change things. People of God have always needed someone to step up and be willing to speak the word. In Ezekiel chapter 22 and verse 30, God says He was looking for someone to do that. I'm looking for someone to stand in the gap before me so that the land will not have to be destroyed. What He says is, I looked and I found no one. Nehemiah says, I'm going to be that man. I'm going to be the one that at least this time I'm going to stand in the gap. I'm going to stand in the way and speak vividly about the reforms that need to take place. The final one that he's going to address is the reform of their relationship. Verses 23 through 31. This practice of marrying foreign wives, this is not something that's new. This is something that's been going on for some time. In fact, Nehemiah points all the way back to Solomon. Do you remember Solomon? Solomon also did these things. This isn't a new problem. We've done this before. And consider all the foreign women that Solomon married. And wasn't Solomon a great king? Wasn't he one of the greatest kings that we've had? He's one of the wisest kings we've had. God loves Solomon. Solomon's foreign wives led him to sin. Somebody like him. Would you follow in his footsteps? Would you make the same poor decisions that he made and be led into the same sin? Again, this is not for the purpose of a supreme race. This has nothing to do with heritage. It has everything to do with holiness. God commanded the children of Israel not to marry the foreign wives, not because somehow those wives are tainted, but because those wives brought with them foreign gods and foreign concepts set against the concepts of God. They would influence the people. We've already seen that taking place here. He says the children of these marriages, they don't even speak the language of Judah. Why is that a problem? Because what's the Torah wrote in? What's the law of God wrote in? How well do you think they know the God that they have been born into this covenant relationship with? They don't even understand the language that He has used to give His desires, to give His law. There is great influence going on, not leading them closer to God, but leading them farther and farther away. And how would the next generation follow after the God that they don't know, nor can they understand? Now consider how Nehemiah addresses it. problem. This is probably one of my favorite things in the book of Nehemiah. I just enjoy this moment. Because what Nehemiah does is he contends with them, he curses them, he strikes them, he pulls out their hair, he makes them swear by God that we will no longer consider these things. We will no longer walk in these ways. Here's why that's amusing. Turn over to Ezra chapter 9. In Ezra chapter 9, we find that this is certainly not a new problem. Ezra 9, verses 1 through 4. Now, when these things had been completed, the princes approached me, saying, the peoples of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land according to their abominations, those of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as their wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race was intermingled with the peoples of the land. Indeed, the hands of the princes and the rulers have been foremost in this unfaithfulness. Note on verse 3. When I heard about this matter, I tore my garment, my robe, and pulled some of the hair from my head and my beard, sat down appalled. And everyone who trembled at the words of God of Israel on account of the unfaithfulness of the exiles gathered to me, and I sat appalled till the evening offering. Consider the stark contrast of Ezra and Nehemiah. Same problem, very different response. Ezra pulls the hair out of his beard. Nehemiah grabs the beard of the guy next to him and rips his hair out. Ezra confronts himself, strikes himself with sorrow. Nehemiah strikes the guy next to him that's committing the sin. I think when we read these things, how oftentimes I think about, if I'm ever caught in sin, I want an Ezra close by, not a Nehemiah. But which one was right? Second question. Acted very differently, and in our mindset, things can't be the same. Which one was right? I'm going to offer up this evening that both of them. We may want an Ezra. Sometimes we need it. Sometimes we need someone to pluck us out of the fire because we know danger. We may want to be Nehemiahs at times. Sometimes we need to be Ezra. We need to be people who are visibly shaken and sorrowed by the effects of sin. Living in a world that's increasingly accepting of sinful behavior, it becomes easier and easier to be desensitized. Whenever you're in fields where you see trauma, there's a problem that comes up, and that is that you begin to just not feel anything from that trauma. You see it over and over again. It doesn't affect you anymore. It doesn't really bother you. It's just something that's a part of your life. And when you're away from that, all of a sudden, in a different circumstance, different scenario, you don't quite know how to interact with the people around you. Sometimes we start looking at that as forms of PTSD for people who come back from very terrible situations, combat. Brethren, we can have the same thing happen. Sin. We're around it every day. We are around it every day. We go to work. We go into our community. We go to the gym. No matter where we are, we're going to come into contact with trauma that is sin in the lives of those around us. It'd be very easy to become so desensitized to it that we just aren't affected. We don't go to the point where we're ready to rend our robe and to set down appalled. Ezra made a difference. People saw it. Disgusted. Nehemiah made it because he showed them, this is disgusting. We will not do this. Sometimes we need a Nehemiah. Sometimes we need Ezra. Now, I want to wrap up this study of Nehemiah with one last look. One thing that stands out more than anything to me throughout the book of Nehemiah. And it won't be his ability to see problems, even from far away. And Nehemiah sees the problem that's going on in Jerusalem. He's all the way in Susa. He's in the heart of Babylon. He sees what's going on. This is a big problem. That's not his greatest quality. And it's also not his ability to inspire people to work. He comes and travels great distance into a land where he doesn't have a lot of connections and somehow inspires all the people to work together to rebuild this wall in 52 days. It's an amazing quality, but it's not his greatest quality. And it's not also his ability to deal with conflict, as he's got these outside forces that are threatening to harm and even kill them. And he's got inside forces that are sabotaging and being fearful, not standing where they should stand. These are all amazing qualities. They're not Nehemiah's greatest quality. Greatest quality was his prayer life. Over and over and over again, Nehemiah's prayer life is brought to the front of the issues that he's dealing with and put on display for us to understand. Chapter 13 is no different. He has prayed 4 prayers in this chapter alone. Verse 14 says, "Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out my loyal deeds which I have performed for the house of my God and its servants." In verse 22, he says, "For this also, remember me, O my God, and have compassion on me according to your greatness, according to the greatness of your loving kindness." That is that word hesed, covenantal faith. Remember me. Speaks of those that have stood against him and says, "Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant, the priesthood and the Levite," showing how he puts things in God over and over again. Very last line of this book of Nehemiah, I think, could be the line that we just take, we stick underneath the name. This is what, "Remember me, O my God." Nehemiah is a man of prayer. And yes, Nehemiah, read through this, you can't help but see that he did everything he could to try to make God's people safer, more secure. Beyond that, he worked to make them pure, to restore proper worship, to encourage obedience. And I don't know how Nehemiah felt when he got back in chapter 2. He felt like an absolute failure. But I know that as a preacher, hardest, difficult days, some of the greatest weight that I've ever bore, come when there are problems amongst them. There are problems. So many times we come to church to escape the problems of the world. What about when there's problems right here? Where do we? My God. Go to God in prayer. He didn't tell God, "Look at what all I've done." He just said, "Please remember me for good. Remember the good that I was able to accomplish through the good hand of the Lord on me." Brethren, is that how you want? How? Remember me, oh my God, for good. Not remember me, Southside Church of Christ, not Lake Street Church of Christ, wherever else that I work with in my life, time that God blesses. Not remember me, Holly or boys. Not remember me, my friends. Nehemiah, the man who just came back and saw that everything is completely fallen off the track, working hard to try and turn things around, closes. God, you please good that I tried. Chapter 13, the chapter is not a chapter about Jews living post-exilic Jerusalem. Chapter 13 is about full of God remembering. Chapter 13 tells us you can't have dual citizenship. You are either God's people or you are not God's people. Chapter 13 tells us you can't offer pure worship in the temple of God until you remove the things which do not belong there, and which ought not talking about our heart. Chapter 13 reminds us we can't let the service of the house of God go by the wayside. Rather, we must contribute. It reminds us we must have our priorities aligned with God for His glory being the first, and it tells us that our got to see the danger. Got to see the dangers that relationships with the world bring, not just upon us, upon our children, our grandchildren. In closing, we'll end where we began. Nehemiah is not a book without a wall. I can't say that enough. Take that away. Nehemiah is not a book. Nehemiah is about a God. A God who can do amazing things, even through one humble, loving, prayerful person who just wants to glorify. It's one of my favorite books. Choose today to be people who are remembered by God for good. Choose today to be people who are rebuilt. The only way that happens is by coming to the Father through His Son, Jesus Christ. You are here this evening, and you want to be remembered by God for good. Be seen by God in the light of His. Would love to assist you. If you would like to come forward, talk about it.